Benny's
I
singing.
have my travel guitar in the car.
Well, Benny's singing, you guys can
Yeah,
do a
let's go.
duo.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the November 16th, 2021 meeting of the Safe and Successful Kids Interlocal Board. I'd like to acknowledge this meeting is being held in the City Council chambers, and we are also governed by the Open Meetings Act, which is posted at the back of the room. I'd like to ask the clerk, would she call the roll? Ms. Gwynn, would you? Yeah. You want me to read more? I can read a lot more here. There's words where it's part, yeah. Yeah, no. I'm sorry, I didn't do that very well.
That's okay.
Good evening, hi.
Roll call, Kathy Janik,
Here.
Connie Duncan,
Here.
Don Mayhew,
Present.
Richard McGinnis,
Excused absence,
Yuri Wheeler,
excused absence.
and Benny Show.
Here. Madam Clerk, do we have enough for quorum? I understand. I'd like to note that we do not have quorum present. We will move through our agenda, but we won't be voting on any action items today because of that. So the next item would be an action item, the approval of the minutes from the August 26th meeting. We will carry that over until our next meeting. The next item on our agenda is public comment. Is there anyone in the audience that would like to, the Safe and Successful Kids Interlocal Board welcomes comments from fellow citizens. At this time, we are taking public comments on any topic not listed on the agenda. The opportunity to comment on the agenda items will come later, at a later point in this meeting. Is there anyone in the chamber today that would like to take advantage of the public comment time to speak about items not on our agenda? 5, 4, 3, 2, we're good, okay. We'd like to thank you all for your participation, and we'll move on to item number 5. Report regarding school resource officers protective programming for the fiscal year 2021. Who will help me with that presentation?
Mr. Chair, I'll just do a brief introduction. My name is Denise Pierce. I work with Lincoln Parks and Rec Department, and I am the liaison to the Safe and Successful Kids Interlocal Board. Today, we want to introduce and welcome LPD Officer Luke Bonkowitz and also Dr. Leslie Eastman from ESU 18 Assessment and Evaluation Team. They've been instrumental in developing our evaluation program and also putting together the report that we're going to hear a little bit more about tonight. So I will turn it over to them.
Okay. I'd like to talk, while they're preparing to presentate, I'd like to talk about the interlocal deals primarily with 3 areas: proactive services, preventive services, and protective services. Tonight we'll be listening to Mr. Bonkowitz, Officer Bonkowitz, talk about protective services. And Ms. Eastman will be joining him if needed, correct?
Oh, yeah, I do the second half. You do
Okay.
the first half.
That's
We've split it up, so I'll start
Nice.
out here and see if I can't work the projector. Okay,
PowerPoint's coming up. There we are.
excellent. Okay, so good evening. We have collected and analyzed an enormous amount of data. And first, we do need to note that this data set was only made possible by numerous people, both at LPD and LPS, actually dozens of people, and we do owe them a debt of gratitude for their diligent work over the last 3 or 4 years. In the 15 minutes that I have, we're only going to scratch the surface and talk about the highlights. Notably, we need to recognize that last year was unique due to the COVID-19 pandemic. About 38% of K through 12 students participated in remote learning for more than 2 weeks during the school year, and 7% of students were remote learners for the entire year. Now, the absence of thousands of students in schools very well may have impacted our data and findings. We need to acknowledge that. And as we noted in last year's report, remote learning due to a global pandemic is unprecedented in the recent history of LPS. We bring this up because we are strongly cautioning people against comparing the data, analyses, and trends from 2020-2021 to prior years or the prior 4-year trend. So let's start off with calls for service and referrals. And again, all of these things were taken from the SSKI agreement, things that we were going to monitor. And first up is calls for service and referral. Just as a brief primer, a referral is a citation that's issued to a juvenile. It's referred to as a juvenile referral, but it is a citation. So each year, LPD responds to an average of about 320 calls for service at the middle schools. Last year, LPD responded to 275 calls for service. On average, we respond to about 990 calls for service at the high schools. Last year, we responded to 474 calls for service at the LPS high schools. Now, given that nearly 40% of students opted for remote learning for at least 2 weeks and were not present in the schools, we would expect the number of calls for service at LPS schools to decrease for the last year. Now, this trend shows that SROs are initiating a lower percentage of calls for service as well. We'll talk about that. And administrators and parents are generating a greater percentage of calls for service, just as a little bit of a tease to the next slide here. So we are examining who initiates calls for service. So when they come to the attention of an SRO, who is initiating them? Last year, when a staff member, initiated a call for service at an LPS middle or high school, an administrator was notified 95% of the time. Now, we examined the instances in which an administrator was not notified, and we found that these instances involved a staff member reporting a personal larceny or vandalism. For example, after hours, and they find that their car has been broken out or windows been broken out. As well as instances where no reports were completed, such as a traffic complaint or a juvenile complaint where officers were unable to locate anyone. We also looked at calls for service initiated by a staff member that resulted in a citation or a juvenile referral. Last year, there was only one case that we could find where an incident occurred at an LPS middle or high school, and we were unable to verify whether an administrator was notified. This incident involved a custodian who called the police about an individual who was in a high school parking lot at midnight who was using narcotics. We responded, we contacted, cited, and released the individual, and this person was not a student. We simply couldn't verify if an administrator was notified. Key takeaways that when teachers and staff members are initiating calls for service at the middle and high schools, including those calls for service that result in a juvenile referral, administrators are being notified the vast majority of the time. And again, those are consistent with prior year's data. I'm going to back up here because I'd like to talk about this. I apologize for going out of order here. So we talked about citations and calls for service. LPD issues about 85 citations or referrals at the middle school each year, and according to the 4-year trend. And then last year we issued 49 citations or referrals at the middle school. Last year we issued 4-year average, we issued about 365 referrals. And last year we issued 181 referrals at the high schools. We also need to consider what percentage of calls for service resulted in a citation or referral. So referrals go up and down, as do calls for service. It's important to note what percentage of those calls for service are resulting in a citation. 4-year average says that LPD officers issued at least one referral in about 25% of the calls for service at the high schools, 33% of the calls for service, 25% in the middle schools, 33% of the calls for service in the high schools. Now, last year, officers issued at least one referral in about 13% of the calls for service at middle schools and 25% of the calls for service at the high schools. Both of those are marked decreases. So one of our main takeaways is that last year, officers issued fewer referrals at both the middle and high schools compared to the 4-year trend, and they issued referrals at a lower rate per call for service compared to the 4-year average. Types of incidents. Members of our community are very interested in knowing what types of incidents our SROs are responding to. We think that this is an important question too. There are 5 types of calls for service that compose the majority of incidents that result in a citation or a referral. Assaults, narcotics offenses, disturbances, more on that in a second, larcenies, and serious property crime, such as burglaries or serious vandalisms. Disturbances do not simply refer to a behavior issue. Disturbances, as we have gone through these calls for service and looked at them, more often than not, they are 2 students who are fighting each other. This is not simply a pushing or shoving match or one student elbowing another. These are instances where 2 students are fighting, they're causing injury to each other, and they're seriously disrupting part of a school or the whole school, so far to the point that part of the school or the entire school has to be closed down or on lockdown because of the threat to other students or staff members. Last year, these 5 offenses made up 82% of referrals. And in general, consistent with previous findings, administrators initiated the largest percentage of these types of incidents, followed by teachers and staff and students. Again, just to repeat, LPD officers are initiating 1% of calls for service at the middle and high schools. When it comes to referrals, they're only initiating 3% of those calls for service. So most of these things are coming to us from students, parents, teachers, and administrators. We are very interested in disparity because we think it's an important issue. It's something that we, as the police department, need to be part of the solution to. So we are monitoring this. As a refresher, the Disparity Index is a measure of the over or underrepresentation in a particular category, such as being a victim or a suspect. Now, a disparity ratio of 1 indicates no disparity. Go above 1, that's overrepresentation in a particular category. Below 1 is underrepresentation in a particular category. Now, in general, the Racial Disparity Index for victims in 2020-2021 closely approximated the 4-year average. Among victims, Native American and African American students are overrepresented, as are students who receive free and reduced lunch. Now, the Racial Disparity Index for suspects or persons responsible, individuals who we believe are responsible for an offense and have or have not cited, that group also approximated the 4-year average for nearly every group of students, with the exception of Native American students. Their disparity their disparity index decreased from 3.2 to 1.9. Now, among suspects and among persons responsible in LPS middle and high schools, Native American and African American students are overrepresented, as are students who receive free or reduced lunch. Now, as in prior years, African American and Native American students were overrepresented, again, both among victims and among persons responsible and free and reduced lunch. I have a little bit more to say about this at the end of my presentation, but more to the point of looking at trends, the victim disparity ratios and the suspect PR ratios did not vary substantially among these different demographic groups last year compared to the 4-year average. And that's really what we're looking at, especially with the introduction of the SROs in the middle schools. So if you look at this particular graph here, there's the 4-year average. It's important to understand that some of these student populations are small sample sizes. So there's not very many Native American students in LPS. And so if 1 or 2 are issued a referral or a citation, that can dramatically affect it, the disparity ratio. We see less of a movement when we have larger sample sizes. And we're interested in the victim disparity ratio, in this next slide, the suspect disparity ratio, and we're basically looking for movement in these different groups, especially in the middle school. So far, with the last 2 years of data, we do not see the disparity ratios increasing or decreasing. They're remaining approximately the same, and something that we're going to need to keep an eye on for the next many years. Complaints and commendations. Last year, LPD investigated 3 complaints against SROs. 2 were for rudeness, 1 was for a policy violation. In 2 instances, complaints were classified as exonerated. 1 instance, the SRO did receive a warning. Last year, SROs received 11 commendations. Some examples include an SRO who assisted helping locate a missing person, an SRO whose conduct during an assault investigation earned the praise of all the parents involved, and finally, an SRO who demonstrated exceptional care and compassion for a youth out of care, sometimes known as a runaway, who was found alone and hungry on the bike trail. We're also interested in what types of presentations and how many presentations SROs are conducting in the middle schools. Last year, SROs conducted 22 presentations for just over 500 students in the high schools, and in the middle schools, about 140 presentations for 3,300 students. Overall, last year, SROs conducted 161 presentations for just under 4,000 students. They were presenting on a variety of topics: alcohol and DUI, community relations. You can see the list there. I will say that something that's equally important to note is that when they're presenting to students in school and talking to students, parents, administrators, and the SROs, often these presentations evolve into more of just a discussion between the students and the SRO. So they may present on a general safety topic, but then the student says, hey, can you just search my car or my backpack? You know, they actually talk about some legal issues, and the SRO is able to talk them through some of these things like, well, I can in certain circumstances, but I can't in these circumstances where I need a warrant. And so it really is a really good conversation between the students and the SROs about what law enforcement is and how we interact in the community. Training hours. 12 SROs received a total of 784 training hours last year. Of these, 272 were SRO related. Some of the examples you can see there are, we're not only giving our SROs basic SRO training, we're giving them training like policing the teen brain, behavioral health threat assessment, mental health disorders, cultural awareness, legal topics, and of course, de-escalation. It's important to note that de-escalation, like community policing, is built into all of LPD's training curriculum. It's not simply a class that officers go to. It's a part of every class and every philosophy, every strategy that we teach. One final note on that. On average, SROs receive 23 hours of SRO-related training. You can see the topics there, and that number of hours does exceed the legislative mandate for SRO training. Lodges at the Youth Services Center. When we began the SRO program in the middle school and continued in the high schools, one of the concerns the community brought to us was the school-to-prison pipeline. So we're monitoring this, and we're aware that people are concerned about this issue, and we want parents and students to know that we're closely monitoring the data for any signs of this issue. Let me give you some context on this. LPS has about 22,000 middle and high school students. On average, LPD issues about 450 juvenile referrals for incidents occurring at the middle or high school. Now, of these referrals, only 3 to 4 students on average are lodged at the Youth Services Center. Last year, no students were lodged at the Youth Services Center for incidents that occurred at a middle or high school. Excuse me. Based on historical data, incidents that result in a referral and a lodge at the Youth Services Center are serious criminal circumstances that endanger the health and well-being of students and staff. In addition, just as I think as an extra bit of knowledge, the majority of youth at the Youth Services Center are actually there due to probation violations and not their first-time offenses. Finally, this is my last piece. Dr. Weiner from UNL is assisting LPD, LPS in Lancaster County in analyzing juvenile recidivism. So he's analyzing this data as well as the larger referral data, which includes incidents not only at public schools, the middle and high schools, but also things that occur outside of the school. And I think he's had some interesting findings on the last couple of years of his data. First of all, juveniles who are issued a referral or a citation by an SRO are more likely to end up in a restorative justice program compared to juveniles who are issued a referral outside of the school. Second of all, juveniles who receive a referral from an SRO are less likely to recidivate compared to juveniles who receive a referral from a non-SRO police officer. We think it has to do with probably the restorative justice aspect of a lot of these SRO referrals, but we acknowledge that we need to do more analysis on that end. Finally, students of color are more likely to be referred by an SRO compared to white students. However, when we control for SES status using free or reduced lunch, the race effect becomes statistically non-significant. In other words, this suggests that the poverty and structural factors may be responsible for the data, or the disparities that we see in our data. We thought that was a really important finding that we needed to bring to your attention. Yes, there is a correlation between disparity in race and SROs. However, when we start to control for some of these structural variables, that correlation goes away. Finally, I am happy to take questions. I also have Assistant Chief Jason Stilley with me to answer questions, but I would ask you to hold them so I can give Dr. Eastman her full time. Thank you.
Thanks, Luke. Good evening. How is everyone tonight? Very good. Good. Beautiful day, right? Before I begin the next part of the presentation, which will focus on the LPS data, let me just take a moment and just talk about what the purpose of the presentation tonight is. This report, this full report, as you well know, is over 150 pages of data with a little bit of narrative, but lots of numbers, lots of information. Obviously, we can't go through all of that in a short presentation, so our goal here is to hit the highlights tonight. We'll show you a couple of examples of data, and Officer Bonkowitz also already did that, just to give anyone who might be watching kind of a flavor for what the back-end data looks like. But we made a decision that we really couldn't present many charts of data and have this presentation be a reasonable amount of time this evening. So, having said that, let's switch gears and let's talk about LPS data. Before I talk about the data, let me give you an overview of what we're going to be looking at. There's actually 2 different kinds of data that we're going to present to you this evening, and then we're included in the report. The first is data from our perception survey. The perception survey actually predates the implementation of the SRO program. The perception survey was developed in-house by my team at LPS. Yeah, we are ESU 18, but we're also LPS. And that survey was designed to measure 4 things. curriculum instruction and assessment as it unfolds within a classroom, student motivation, student engagement, and aspects of culture and climate for the building and for the classrooms. When we implemented the SRO program, it occurred to us that there was an opportunity to add some questions to the existing perception survey that focused on SROs, rather than creating a whole nother survey. And actually, in hindsight, that ended up being a really good thing, because as you are well aware, we've had to do a lot of additional surveying because of the pandemic and needing to get input from our community with regard to our plans and protocols. So it's good that we didn't add an entire additional survey. So the perception survey, we're going to present a couple of things tonight from the perception survey. First of all, the piece that focuses specifically on SROs. Students are first asked if they had a direct experience with an SRO. If they respond yes, then they're taken to a series of questions asking them to summarize what that experience was like for them. There also are some other questions on the perception survey that, while they're not directly focused on the SRO program, we think are important to share with you because it provides some context for the schools and what the climate and culture of the schools looks like. And that's an important thing, we think, to monitor, even though we don't necessarily think it's directly impacted by the SROs or the SRO program, okay? So we'll have those two pieces. The other thing I need to tell you about the survey before we actually look at any of the results, this is actually a suite of surveys. There are 3 parallel surveys. One is for students, and we begin giving that at 5th grade, but we're only going to be looking at the secondary results because we only have SROs in our secondary schools. The second survey is actually for parents and guardians, and it's parallel. It basically is asking the same information. Of course, the language has been adjusted for parents so that it's appropriate and it's also relevant. The third and final parallel survey is for certificated staff. So these would be teachers, administrators, librarians, counselors. So it's the certificated. It's not all of the staff in the building, but specifically the certificated. The big reason that we give the perception survey to the certificated staff is because of the section on curriculum instruction and assessment. So rather than change that, we went with that. We give this survey every year, typically in the spring of the year, March or April. We don't give it until spring because we want people to have a pretty good extended experience with that school year so that they have something that they can share with us about how they felt things are going, what their perceptions are. The other thing I need to tell you about the perception survey, so these are the same sort of caveats and warnings that Officer Bonkowitz gave you. Pandemic changed things, clearly. So if you look at students and the adults in the buildings, we had a hybrid learning model in place in all of our buildings, where some students were remote, some students were in the classroom. And at the elementary and at the middle school, that was student-parent choice. At our high schools, we did move to an A-B model that allowed us to reduce the number of students in the building on any given day so that we would be better able to implement our protocols in a safe manner that made sense given the pandemic. So schools were operating at about a 50% capacity on any given day. So clearly that is going to affect student discipline data, which is the second type of LPS data that I'm going to talk about tonight. And also probably perception data because they're spending less time in the building. So that certainly can also play out. The perception survey also was not administered in the 2020 school year. You might remember that from last year's report. We were all out remote at that point in time when we would normally have administered the survey. We talked about it, we thought about it, it just did not make sense to try to send out a perception survey under those conditions. So we did not. So what you have this year is the data from spring of 2021. Okay? All right, so having said all of that, now let me tell you a little bit about the actual results. We'll start with the students because my book, the students are the most important, so we'll begin there. With regard to the items that focused on SROs, overall, the responses were fairly positive. However, students of color rated their interactions slightly less positively than their white peers. Still pretty positive all in all, but less positive. To give you a sense of what that looks like, I do have some data for you. This will also allow you to see what the actual questions were that were asked with regard to their interaction with the SRO. So the first question is, the SRO listened to my side of the story. So we have this broken down by race, ethnicity, and you can see that mostly we're talking 50% or above are saying that they either believe that this statement is mostly or completely true. I do feel I want to stop for just a moment and say this about these results. You know, I've been at LPS for 25 years, and we have solicited a lot of feedback from students, and we've surveyed students. And generally speaking, our students aren't necessarily all that positive. To have results that are this positive was rather surprising, frankly. So I think that's worth noting. If you look at this, the discrepancy is most noticeable for the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander students and students identifying as Black African American. Now, that Native American Pacific Islanders are a really small group. So again, with a very small group, you have one or two students that are not happy with their experience, and it's really going to impact the results. It doesn't mean that every student's experience isn't important. It just means when we're looking at group results, we need to consider that and recognize that those numbers might go up and down a little bit from year to year. But it's not discounting the importance of every single student voice. The next question has to do with whether they were treated fairly in the situation that the SRO was involved in. And again, overwhelmingly positive, slightly less positive for our students of color. The low group here is, again, that Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander. We're talking about less than 5 students here, okay? So it's a pretty small group. But otherwise, the responses are pretty similar across most of the racial ethnic groups. The SRO treated me with respect. Wow, this one is extremely positive across the board. And now we're looking at 75% or more in most cases agreement with this statement. I think that's important. So clearly our SRO officers are being very respectful in terms of how they're interacting with our students, and our students are feeling that respect. The final question is, the SRO behaved in a professional manner, and again, pretty similar to the other questions having to do with the SRO. So now switching gears away from the questions having to do with SROs and looking at some of the broader issues related to curriculum instruction, assessment, student motivation, student engagement, culture and climate, the rest of the survey. Again, the responses are generally positive, but if you look at which items were a little bit lower than some of the rest of the items, the biggest issues that are emerging here are fairness of rules, consistency across teachers, and adult responses to bullying. And to give you a sense of what this data looks like from the report, I've got an example of a graph. The circles that I've superimposed on here draw your attention to the areas that we believe are a little less positive than some of the others. But again, overall, the responses are generally fairly positive. But these are a little lower than some of the other areas, so we need to take note and kind of pay attention to that and think about what that means and what kinds of things that we need to be considering as we continue to interact with our students. Parent-guardian data, same time frame, last spring. One thing I need to say about the parent-guardian data for the spring of 2021 is our response rate was a little lower than it has been in the past. And I think that's because we had to survey our parents so frequently during the 2021 school year in the spring of the 1920 school year, as we were trying to make decisions about hybrid learning, remote learning, and other issues associated with the pandemic. So I think, frankly, we had some survey fatigue on the part of our parents and guardians. But we still did get responses. And again, as we look at the responses, really very, very similar to what we saw for students. fairly positive. We were not able to make any comparisons across racial ethnic groups because of the low number of responses, but in general, it's a very similar pattern overall to what we saw for students. And again, students agreeing with their parents, interesting outcome. For the rest of the survey, the items that are the non-SRO items, again, generally positive. The biggest issues are consistency and behavioral expectations across teachers, fairness in school discipline policies and practices, and adult responses to bullying. Sounds just like the issues that the students identified. And then the final group, certificated staff. On the SRO items, the pattern was pretty similar to students and to parents and guardians. Generally pretty positive. We really couldn't disaggregate here. We just did not have enough numbers to do any racial ethnic disaggregations. And then on the rest of the perception survey, again, responses are generally positive. The biggest issues, according to staff, are issues around fairness and consistency across teachers. Nice triangulation of data, right? Okay. Yes, we're always happy when that happens. Now, we're going to switch gears and talk about another category of data from Lincoln Public Schools. And that data is the school discipline data. Again, we don't believe this is directly impacted by the SROs or the SRO program, but it's an important contextual piece that we need to keep an eye on, just to see if things are bubbling up differently in our buildings in a way that might correspond with some issues around the implementation of the SRO program, okay? So with student discipline, we're gonna look at three things. We're gonna look at in-school suspensions, out-of-school suspensions, and expulsions. And the way that we look at this information is we take the data for the school year and we compare it to the census information for the school year. So in public schools across the state of Nebraska, on the final Friday of September, everybody's supposed to take a snapshot of their student population. And the snapshot includes information about race, ethnicity, participation in special programs such as English language learners, students receiving special education services, students participating in free and reduced lunch. We have gender, we know what school they attended, all kinds of things. So we use that as the point of comparison. So as we look at the discipline data, we're going to compare it to that census information so that we can talk about disproportionality. Do we have certain groups overrepresented in terms of in-school suspensions or expulsions? Or do we have groups underrepresented? So that's the context for this section. So beginning with, and again, usual caveats, COVID-19, certainly that has changed this data. It certainly has impacted this data. This is also a quick reminder. There was an evaluation plan that was put together, that was presented to the community, that was brought to this board. There was a series of objectives. This is just an example of how the objectives map back to some of the data that we're talking about tonight. So these are the objectives that we think are relevant for the student discipline data. Okay, in-school suspensions. So again, we have a 4-year baseline, and then we've got this year's discipline data. There's a few notable changes as we're comparing the 2021 school year to the baseline. In many cases, we're seeing some of the same disproportionality that we've seen in the past for our students of color and for those participating in special programs, special ed, English language learners, students receiving free reduced lunch. However, the rate of in-school suspensions for Black African American students appears to be less disproportionate for in-school suspension than it was in previous years, particularly at the high school level. Yay.
Say that again.
I will say that again. The rate of in-school suspensions for students identifying as Black African American appears to be less disproportionate than in previous years. So it's coming down in terms of the disproportionality. Now, I also have to say this is 1 year's worth of data. So we need to really continue to track this very carefully as we look at data for this year and in subsequent years to see whether this is a trend or whether this is an anomaly. And we just frankly don't know quite yet, but still something worth noting. Out-of-school suspensions. With regard to out-of-school suspensions, again, typically the same disproportionality we've seen in the past for students of color and those participating in special programs. However, a couple notable things. The rate of out-of-school suspensions for high school students receiving special education services and for those participating in the free and reduced lunch program appears to be more disproportionate than in previous years. Right. Again, keeping a close eye on that to see if this is a trend or an anomaly. And then finally, expulsions. Now, with regard to expulsions, this is a much, much smaller sample size. So as we look at demographic groups, there's going to be a little more instability in some of these numbers from year to year because of the smaller sample sizes. Again, the overall trend is pretty consistent with what we've seen in the past. However, a couple of things. For middle school students, those identifying as 2 or more races appear to show a little increase in disproportionality. This is also true for female students, not something we've seen in the past. On the other hand, the rate for male students is no longer disproportionate. Interesting, but again, anomaly, trend. Time will tell. For the high school, it's a little bit different. The rate of expulsions for high school students identifying as 2 or more races was 0. So there was no disproportionality at the high school level for that group. On the other hand, the disproportionality for students identifying as Asian, those receiving special education services, and students participating in the free and reduced lunch program showed an increase in disproportionality. So all of this is information that we will follow carefully. The other thing that needs to be said at this point in time is that this data is not data that we just started looking at when we implemented the SRO program. We've been looking at this data for 7 or 8 years, Russ, somewhere along that line. And we have board equity goals, which there are 4 board equity goals that are being implemented. And one of the 4 board equity goals focuses specifically on student discipline. So we have a larger effort in place to really look at some of the disproportionality that we're seeing in this discipline data, and to really create some action plans about how we can further address that and get that disproportionality down. And I'm sure that Russ co-chairs the committee that's focusing on that particular board goal. So if we have some questions about that, I'm sure Russ would be happy to answer your questions. So that's the data that we wanted to be able to cover. So at this point in time, Luke, you want to come back up with me? We'll just socially distance, so we don't have to put the mask on. And then we'll take questions. And if there's someone in the audience that we think can answer the question better than we can, we'll invite them up.
Thank you, Ms. Eastman. Is there any questions from
Yep, that way.
Ms. Danig? Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to start. I have a couple.
And then
I'm going to go from the back forward because it's easier for my brain to do.
Recency effect.
So when you talk about expulsion student data, and this might be a Russ question more than you did the data, but what triggers an in-school suspension? What triggers an out-of-school suspension? And when do we go to an expulsion?
Why don't you come up to the mic?
So I'm going to work backwards too. So I'm going to start with expulsions. Expulsions are the least number of those 3. And an expulsion happens when a student has a significant offense at a building. What our buildings would do is they would do a 5-day suspension and a referral to student services through a meeting with the building administrator, the parent, the student, and one of our administrators. If the determination of an expulsion is warranted, those would be for significant offenses, things like weapons possession. It could be a drug possession. It could be significant fights, or it could be repeated serious offenses. We have what we call a student support program where the education of that student continues. And so even though they may be expelled for the student for the rest of the semester, they still are receiving their education, as well as we focus a lot on behavior and social emotional learning to help reduce recidivism for that. An out-of-school suspension, again, would be a significant offense that happened at the building. Some of the same ones that I had talked about before. It's going to be those more serious things around, a possible really serious verbal altercation or physical altercation or drugs or alcohol, those types of things. And an in-school suspension can be used in a variety of ways. I mean, in one way, it can be used as an alternative to out-of-school suspension. The benefit of an in-school suspension is the student is in school, they are assigned to a room, but they are working on homework. Frequently, teachers come in and help them, etc. Those would be areas of where it may not be warranted that a student is out of school, but it is significant enough that maybe the student needs to be out of class for a period, or it could be for a full day.
And do they get the services they need? For example, I heard Leslie say it was a higher rate of free and reduced lunch and special education students. So do they get those services that they need?
Yes. Yeah.
So one of my concerns has always been, and I've been doing this for 2 decades, so I just ask the questions from a person who's not in the school every day, is that a special education student disproportionately gets a pass, is what the story is. That's the story that you hear out in the community. There's whatever the reason, it's whatever excuse they give. But my bigger concern is when they leave the protected environment of Lincoln Public Schools, if we're not helping them learn how to behave in a society, those special ed students that leave our walls become visiting Luke's walls, and they become in a prison. And the idea of a special ed person being in the prison terrifies me. Well, any of it terrifies me, but a special ed student especially. What are we doing to make certain, and you don't have to give me an answer today, maybe you can sit me down someday and talk. What are we doing to help special education students to get that sense of right and wrong and living in a bigger community so that they don't make these repeat offenses? I can use an example. I volunteered with some SPED students, and they were huggers, and some people are offended by hugging, and some of the hugs got a little more assertive than maybe they should have. But if you're out in the big world, that hug can send you to jail. Mm-hmm. And it isn't called a hug at that point. So what do we do to help these kids understand so when they leave our protected environment, they can live in the world at large?
So through the process of a student being identified as needing special education supports, there are many reasons for that. It could be physical, it could be behavioral, it could be hearing loss. There's a lot of different reasons for it. As part of that IEP or that individual education plan, we take a look at what are the needs of the student and how do we help support them. So if it's related to behavior, what we do is part of that plan is developed around what supports do the student need in the classroom, how can we teach and help the student learn appropriate behavior. And then we also look at, we talk a lot about function. What's their function of their behavior? And then we develop a behavioral plan around that. So it's all around teaching and supporting the student based on what that is. And the hope is, and we're able to do this in many situations, but a IEP, a special education label, is able to be removed over time for some students to where they still need some supports, but maybe not the intense supports that they need through an IEP.
I know it's a bigger question, or a bigger answer and a bigger question than we could do here, but
That's the short, quick answer.
and I'm trying my darndest to understand this so that
Yep.
we can make sure the supports are in place, so, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayhew?
Thank you. I just have a quick question. First off, thank you both for the presentations. I think that most of what we saw tonight is fairly consistent with things that we've seen in past presentations, which is, it's good. I'm trying to wrap my mind around one of the last things that Officer Bonkowitz said, though, when you were talking about acknowledging, as we've seen in the past, that referrals happen at a disproportionate rate for children of color. But I think the thing that I heard tonight that was new to me, at least, was the fact that when we normalize for poverty, then those discrepancies become statistically insignificant. And I'm trying to figure out what that means, and what I'm coming up with is that that would indicate that children of color are disproportionately affected by poverty. Is that correct?
Yes. Oftentimes, we talk about the overlap between people of color and income inequality in this country and how it plays out in many different venues, the criminal justice system, education, we could go on and on about that. But that is the essential point, less about race and more about income inequality with relating to these criminal justice outcomes.
Sure.
Certainly don't want to minimize skin color or anything like that.
And
That
I
is.
do want to add that that is not.
Please move back to the microphone, Ms.
Yep, I can do that. I'll use my outdoor voice. We do not want to be sending the message, however, that we should stop looking at race, ethnicity, and disproportionality. Because I think that poverty is an important factor, but I don't think it's the whole factor. So I think we need to keep monitoring it, keep watching it, and keep thinking about our action plans and how we can address that in our action plans. And I think a big part of that, and okay, this is me, not the evaluator, so I'll just say, I think a big part of it is that sense of belonging in school. I see myself reflected in the curriculum and the instruction. I feel valued. I feel like my voice is important. And those are many of the things that we're focusing on with the board equity goals. And I think that's the important way to kind of look at some of that information as well.
If I could piggyback on that, just as a takeaway, only point in bringing that in was not to dismiss that race, the claim, but simply broaden our gaze with regard to race because it is very multidimensional.
That's where my mind is as well. It's not so much to discount race or the experiences that our kids are having in the classroom, but I'm thinking back to when there was quite a bit of outreach from members of the community saying that we needed to get our resource officers out of school, and out of the schools. And we still hear from those folks every once in a while. And I think part of the benefit of collecting this data and doing this kind of analysis is that perhaps it leads to different conclusions, that the presence of the resource officers in the school is perhaps not as impactful to the disproportional effect as societal structures such as poverty and other factors perhaps. So still kind of going around it in my mind, but I find this, again, this kind of data-driven decision-making very beneficial, I think.
And the perception survey responses would suggest that there's some very positive things happening in that interaction between our students and our SROs. So I think that's worth taking into consideration as well.
Good, thank you.
Ms. Duncan, did you have a question?
I do not have a question.
Well, I'm going to take a moment and.
Ms. Danik does.
I have one more.
Please, Ms. Danik.
Sure?
Yes,
Okay.
I'm sure.
So I went backward and I'm going to the beginning because Officer Bonkowitz. So I did this to Russ and I did it to school about expulsions. Can you use the same analogy of when does a school resource officer get engaged in a school? Because as I recall the data, it's all about who reported it and who the offenses. But I've also been in schools where I've seen the administrators handling it. We have a security personnel on site. So tell me when the school resource officer gets involved, because I've noticed that interaction on a negative basis has gone way down.
Sure. So the short answer is it depends.
Okay.
The long answer is there is discretion on the part of administrators and teachers, but that discretion is guided by training that's put on every year that all administrators have to attend, along with SROs. And during this training, they bring up different scenarios that happen in schools and talk through them to plan for them. I would say that discipline issues remain discipline issues. So if a student is refusing to sit down, won't go back to class, whatever, that's something the SRO is not called to. If they are, they back out of it, and that's left to the administration or the teacher. However, if it crosses into the criminal realm, as well as if they are posing some sort of threat or danger to the well-being or the safety of the students or staff, that's when the SRO needs to get involved. There's a great deal of communication that goes on between administrators and SROs as what do we have and what is most appropriate. And they frequently shuffle back and forth between the two where they say, is this an SRO? And the SRO say, no, I think this might be an administrator, and we'll get the administration involved. And there are some times when the SRO says, hey, listen, I'm thinking about this from a law enforcement standpoint. we might want to maybe get our threat assessment team involved, something like that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Danik. I want to springboard on that a little bit, and then something Ms. Eastman said about the perception survey. So, Officer Bunkowitz, you talked about 82% of the reports come from administrators, teachers, students, and parents.
82% from administrators and teachers.
Okay, parents weren't in that. Those
Parents are included in the data, but they're not in that 82%.
got it. Thank you. That was a conflation. And 1% from LPD.
Yes, that's accurate.
So
1%, 3% of the referrals, 1% of the overall calls for service, 3% of the referrals. So this larger universe of
Yes.
calls for service, referrals, and 3% of those are initiated by SROs.
Thank you. And that's very helpful because as we've gone through this process the last few years, when we started the conversation a little earlier today with that perception of the school to prison pipeline. And I think the perception of the public is that that disciplinary thing that was happening, that our SROs are trying to disengage themselves from, was considered the first step toward that. And I think your data does not support that. Would that be fair to say?
That's accurate. I think it's important to be concerned about a school to prison pipeline, but it's also important to let local data drive local decisions. And that's what we're doing here.
Most of those referrals and citations are fall in that category of, I wrote that down here somewhere.
Pretty serious
The
offenses.
assaults, disturbances, fights between students which are endangering their well-being, narcotics offenses, and serious property crime like burglaries, robberies, things like that.
Okay. Things that would fall in the realm of a crime.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Officer Monkowitz. Ms. Eastman, I'd like to have a question about the perception. And this is something that you said that the students said was true, mostly true or completely true,
Yes,
that I felt listened to
yes,
and I felt respected.
yes.
That's exciting to hear that.
It's very exciting to hear that. Yeah,
I'm not an educator, and I lean on my friends who are.
yeah.
But I wonder whether young people have the ability to understand whether they've been listened to or feel respected. Do they have the same
I think
evaluation tools? But
Right. I think secondary students, I think we should start by remembering that we're talking about secondary students. I would say high school students certainly, but even middle school students, they have, I think, a pretty good sense of whether someone listened to them or not, because that's a very kind of relationship sort of driven experience.
and that's it. The
And they may not
relationship.
understand it in exactly the same way. And the deal with any perception survey is they're going to have their take and their interpretation on it. But given that the data was so positive, I think there is an important takeaway there nonetheless.
Thank you. I'm gonna.
We were surprised.
I was
frankly.
surprised too,
We
and I
were
wish
surprised.
would some of those students be available to help me explain this to some adults I bump into on the street that I am.
They
listen-
will be our adults on the
that I
street
am
at
listening
some
to them
point in
and
time.
they were
That
heard.
might be a long-term outcome
Yes.
associated with this program.
I have no other questions.
Yep.
Members of the panel?
Thank
Is there
you so
anyone?
much.
Is there anyone in the audience that'd like to speak on this topic? And remember, any comments made now need to be restricted to just this report. Long pause while no one comes forward. Okay.
Called wait time in education.
Wait time. Is that what you got? Wait time? Yes.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think that moves us to item number 6 on our agenda, which is amendments to the rules of governance. And since we do not have a quorum, we there's no report. There was just, all right. So is there anything else to come before this board tonight? I think it's time for us to go. Do I need to have a motion?
We can't vote.
Nope, can't vote. So I will say thank you all for attending tonight. Thank you for the lovely report. I'd like to thank all the people that gave a hand, Officer Bunkowitz, Dr. Eastman, Mr. Ewan. All the contributions to making that report a success was greatly appreciated. I look forward to sharing that information, and I will declare this board meeting adjourned. Now, gavel.
Boom.